When you look about the opportunities that technologies bring, you have to acknowledge that, at least in regard to certain areas like transparency, to a certain degree also accountability, but even in areas of non-discrimination, if implemented right, technologies can bring enormous benefits. We have those opportunities that do exist and that are very relevant if the technologies are implemented well. But it can go both ways, and specifically in the context where you have a very shrinking space for civil society. If they're implemented badly, you also have a situation where you're making things much worse. That's to say that you have an issue with migration, or you have an issue with criminal justice, or you have an issue related to human rights, and you assume that just by developing a new technology that this issue will go away. And a lot of the time, this silver bullet approach to technology not only doesn't make things better, it makes things worse. And so what we were discussing is how you can get beyond the silver bullet approach of expecting technologies to solve all of the problems of the world, and instead see how technologies can go hand in hand with change processes, with social processes, with governance processes, to ensure that there's a close coupling between the technological process and the governance process and the societal process. Because if you couple those effectively, and you ensure that they are meaningfully interrelated with each other, then you can actually have positive change, and you can actually develop things in a certain direction. But the technology on its own is just a silver bullet. It's completely empty and meaningless without being contextualized and without being deeply coupled and integrated within societal and governance processes. The idea around the rights-based approach is basically to ensure that in all aspects of the technology process and in the development project, from beginning to end, you systematically consider human rights. So at the beginning, you make sure that you're including all relevant stakeholders, that you're ensuring that also all human rights are considered, and that it's not just a rights-based approach that only looks at one right or another, or that plays the rights off against each other in the worst case, but instead that you're considering the universality of human rights. And in doing so, you're ensuring accountability, transparency, and non-discrimination. Technology can enable many of those factors. It allows human rights to be supported and enabled, and they can create enabling environments and enabling technologies. But of course, in the worst case, if technologies are used to surveil or limit rights, it also can have the opposite effect, especially with large development projects. If you do them wrong, they can have significant human rights harms and can actively be contributing to making things worse around the world rather than making things better. For example, in the case of the spread of surveillance technologies around the world, we have a strong effect where if they're supported and developed as part of, let's say, integrated security systems to prevent migration, you very quickly have effects where you're not just talking about technologies which are being used to, let's say, support the criminal justice sector or to enable policing, but they're actively being used to suppress communities, to limit human rights, or to prevent freedom of assembly. And the effect of that is that you have multiple ICT systems that are being used by governments and government-to-government cooperation in a way that is not following a rights-based approach, but instead is simply supporting government power. And in the most benevolent sense, in the most benevolent government, that might be a good thing. But I think it's past the point that we can just assume governments anywhere in the world, whether in Europe or elsewhere, are benevolent. And instead, they need to be held to account and need to be transparent in their actions. Technologies can support that or hinder that, depending on which ones we support. I think on the one hand, they're surrounded by a lot of political pressure to more actively engage with digital technologies. And we do live in an environment where it's politically sexy to have more digital development initiatives, while at the same time acknowledging that they have a far greater need for support in doing so. And so in my experience of the training today, and also in talking to people in similar roles beforehand, they don't have the sufficient support and the sufficient training and expertise to be able to make those decisions. They just see the consequences of when things go wrong or when things happen badly. And of course, because you don't want to be in that position if you're developing a project like that, you're hesitant to engage. And so I think part of the goal is to take away the fear of engaging with these things and also give people the tools to properly evaluate. Because there's so many buzzwords flying around that it becomes very difficult to accurately ascertain what is actually happening in the context of these technologies. But that once you've got past the buzzwords and got a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of how projects happen, you're really in a position to not just make sure that the EU's money is spent well, but make sure that it actually contributes to a positive change in the world. The one example that we were using now is to employ a persona-based approach, where you're basically talking in great detail about the individual civil society actors that your project may be helping or hindering, and you're getting into the context of those actors and understanding their life worlds, their roles, their meanings, rather than just doing it at a distance. So you're not speaking as like a distant policy analyst, but you try and more accurately characterize their specific context. And these approaches are very common in technology development, but are less common in digital policy technology development. And so we're trying to learn from some of these approaches and also understand what are the roles, what are the contexts that a development policy officer needs to understand, and what are the, let's say, the things that they would perhaps otherwise miss, to ensure that when you're assessing impacts, you're doing so effectively and meaningfully, and you're not doing so from afar, but within a greater deal of embeddedness in the local communities.